Okay, welcome to this seminar. This is a joint seminar of NUPI's Center for European Studies and NUPI's, or the Nordic Center for Europe-Asia Relations, or Asia Research, here at NUPI. My name is Pernille Rikard. I'm a research professor here at NUPI. I would just inform you before we start that this seminar will be streamed. So in this seminar, we will discuss if, how, and to what extent Trump, with his new approach and newly launched trade war, is pushing Europe and Asia closer together. Trump's decision to tear up the Trans-Pacific Trade Agreement, pull out of the Paris Climate Change Accords, denounce the Iran nuclear deal, attack the WTO, and introduce tariffs on long-standing allies has led to great uncertainty and anxiety in the Asia-Pacific region, but also in Europe. This has led to a shift in many Asian countries, and we see a certain reorientation towards Europe, which is regarded as a staunch defender of the rule-based multilateral system. And several free trade agreements between the EU and Asian countries have been signed, and new agreements are under negotiations. The EU has also decided to deepen its security relationship with Asia, and next month there will be the biannual ASEM summit in Brussels, with Norway also participating as a full member. Some of the key questions that we would like to address in this seminar are the following. First, what are the implications of Trump's policies for the global order and for EU-Asia relations? Is there sufficient commonality between Europe and Asia to defend the multilateral system? How to deal with China, which has a very different value system and has launched its massive Belt and Road Initiative? And finally, how should the EU and Norway respond? We are very pleased here to have Dr. Fraser Cameron with us here today to address these questions and assess these new trends and discuss different options for Europe in dealing with Trump and Asia. Cameron is the director of EU-Asia Center in Brussels, which is a think tank seeking to promote closer relations between EU and Asia. He is also a former European Commission advisor and a well-known policy analyst and commentator on EU and international affairs. And he is a visiting professor at different places, Hertie School of Governance in Berlin, St. Andrews University, the University of Auckland, and senior advisor to the European Policy Center. So we very much look forward to your presentation, Fraser. So the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, and good morning. I've been here a couple of times before, so it's great to be back in Norway and Oslo at this very distinguished institute. Politics in Brussels at the moment is seen through the lens of ABC. America first, Brexit, and China. I mean, these, to simplify things, are what is preoccupying the leaders as they head to Salzburg today for their informal summit. And they're interlinked in a way because we're all reeling from the shock of Trump's policies which affect the whole world. Brexit is a classic lose-lose situation for the UK and the EU. And the big global story of the past 40 years has been the rise of China and how you cope with China and the implications for the international system. So this is the background to the talk I'll be giving this morning, and it will focus very much on how these developments, and particularly the actions of Trump, have pushed Europe and Asia closer together. They were moving together, but the actions of Trump have actually moved them faster together. Now let me see how we can move this forward. Is it one way like that? Yeah. So, I mean, the EU has taken some time to recognize the importance of Asia. The very first communication that the EU did was 17 years ago now, when it looked at the relationship between Europe and Asia and said, well, this is a continent rising. We must do more to improve our relationship, and sketched out a number of policy areas in which the two sides should cooperate. Obviously, the main emphasis was on trade, and this was, of course, in the era when China was just joining the WTO. So there was a lot of sort of finger pointing and saying, well, China, you must be a good boy and do this, and this, and we will help you become a responsible member of the international community. So there's still a feeling that Asia was this entity that had much to learn from Europe. It wasn't particularly regarded as an equal then. But over the coming years, it became quite clear that Asia was driving growth. This became abundantly clear after the 2008 financial crisis, when it was essentially China that kept the international economy going. And it developed further, I think, when you saw not only the spectacular growth rates in China, India and other countries, but also the growing financial muscle, the fact that more and more Asian countries, particularly India, China, Japan, Korea, were all investing heavily in the EU, so that gave the interlinkage between their financial muscle and jobs. And it was these four countries with whom the EU first had strategic partners. I mean, the word strategic partner is a bit overused. I mean, we still technically have Russia as a strategic partner, and I know you do a lot of work here in Russia, but Russia is by no means a strategic partner. Arguably, it's not a partner except in one or two very specific areas at the moment. The difficulty with extending these strategic partners, I mean, a number of other countries, particularly Indonesia, has been wanting this term for some time, is quite simply a lack of resources. The EU institutions have not devoted money, manpower to the Asia-Pacific region as it has to the neighborhood for obvious reasons. So you can't simply staff up divisions to deal with more strategic partners than we currently have. I mean, for example, with China, we have 70 dialogues. Well, just think about what this means in terms of manpower going to actually take part in all these various dialogues. So what we did was we actually looked at ASEAN as a whole. I mean, any regional organization that starts to develop is supported by the EU. It's part of the EU's DNA, whether you're in ECOWAS or Mercosur or South Africa, regional development cooperation. So we have devoted much more attention to ASEAN than perhaps any other regional organization. I think it's been a bit of a disappointment. I mean, it's partly inevitable, given there are 10 countries and they're very disparate in terms of their size, particularly their economic size. You fly from Singapore, which is a GDP perhaps not that dissimilar to Norway, to Cambodia, which is, about $2,000 a year. So, I mean, there's a huge disparity, but which makes it very difficult to actually establish a region-to-region FTA. So the trick is to actually start by going down individual countries to do FTAs. Now, when we just look at America, we had always hoped, and there's still a faint hope in some quarters, that there could be more cooperation between the EU and the US when it comes to Asia, dealing with thematic issues like human rights or opening up markets and so on. And this led to an exchange of letters between Cathy Ashton, when she was the High Representative, so it's 5 years ago now, and Hillary Clinton to actually work together. So we had something on paper in terms of an agreement to seek areas to work together, but it didn't really lead to any operational movement together because we were competitors in some areas. On trade, we were competitors. And on human rights, it was quite difficult to work with America when we used to actually lobby against the death penalty in America, for example. So it's difficult going in to lobby against the death penalty in the Philippines when the Americans still have it. So there were problems there of working on the normative agenda. I've just put Myanmar there as an example where we did do quite well in terms of sometimes a good cop, bad cop type approach towards the military there, because the Americans had more influence on the military than we had, but it obviously has been quite limited in practice. So what's been the biggest game changer in recent times? Well, I put it down to Shinzo Abe. I mean, he had been blowing hot and cold on an FTA with the EU until he started playing golf with Donald Trump. Now, he thought, you know, a few rounds of golf would solve all the problems, and frankly, it's one of my preferred ways of diplomatic contact too. Asians like golf, but it didn't produce any results. In fact, Japan has been hit by tariffs just like the EU, and they have not, you know, had the reassurances that they were seeking from this administration in different fields. So he basically took the decision, we've got to move forward and clinch this deal, which happened in July, just a few months ago. And it's the biggest FTA since the WTO was formed. So, I mean, it's big in terms of what its impact will be. And why did he do it? Firstly, he was really shocked, as Pranil said at the beginning, in terms of America walking away from TPP. ABBA had invested so much in that, domestically and in the region, that he saw Japan had to do something to try and preserve the rules-based system, and he looked to the EU as a pillar in terms of supporting that international system. I think, too, that the other countries were in the same position. With Korea, we have a very good functioning FTA for several years, plus agreements on the political and security front. We've got actually 3 major agreements with Korea, and that is something we haven't got with any other country in the region. With China, we've moved away from the finger-pointing to a very all-embracing relationship. It's by far the biggest strategic partner that the EU has in Asia. I think there's more visits to China last year than all other Asian countries put together. But although it's our biggest trading partner, we've basically agreed to disagree on the question of market economy status. China basically promised when it joined the WTO, we are moving steadily towards a market economy, and therefore you must grant us this status in 16 years and 15 years, end of 2016. And we said, in consultation with America and Japan and others, look, you're not a market economy. Look at the interference you have in the state-owned enterprises and the banks, etc. So we're not going to do this. So they were annoyed and took us to court, and there's a court case pending in the WTO at the moment. But as you know, WTO is under serious threat because of the lack of judges. America has blocked the appointment of all judges at the moment, so goodness knows when that case will be resolved. Trade disputes, well, there we share some views with America in terms of lack of market access and forced technology transfer and so on. But it's nothing to what America and China are doing at the moment in terms of their trade disputes. And then on human rights, there's still ongoing disputes there, and I think Norway is well aware of the troublesome factor human rights can be in that relationship there. But interestingly enough, at the last summit in July, which was back-to-back with Japan, Xi Jinping and European leaders had an interesting discussion about Trump. And I think Xi Jinping also said, right, this is also time to move forward in the relationship with the EU. And basically, China unblocked a couple of chapters in the current investment treaty negotiations that are going on. So that was able to move forward, and a sign that the Chinese side wanted to move the relationship onto a new level. And quite a lot of good practical work is being done. I think one flagged up for Norway's interests. We have an oceans partnership now with China, which covers pollution, environmental cooperation, fishing. It's not geographically limited, but there's obviously some sensitive areas on both sides there. Illegal fishing is a big issue. With India, we've just had 2 days of talks in India, in Brussels over the last Monday, Tuesday. We have a 1.5 track dialogue. India brought a very strong delegation. And again, Modi wants to up the relationship with the EU, particularly in areas obviously of interest to India, maritime security, being top of his agenda. But we're still lacking the breakthrough in terms of trade negotiations. I mean, trade is not nearly as intensive as it is with China, but this FTA negotiation has been stuck now for several years, and we're trying to unblock it and move forward. I mean, our view is that India has not really developed an internal market that would allow us to have the market access that European companies are looking for. India, of course, wants more flexibility on migration side. Missed one. We missed out Trump. So I think I was in Washington just 10 days ago for a couple of days, and there's firstly a sense of confusion everywhere amongst the think tanks and State Department about what's going on. I mean, I think the description of Bob Woodward crazy town is very apt. I mean, people really have no idea what's going on, and his decision making, shall we say, leaves a lot to be desired. But we were all shocked, when he actually described the EU in an interview as a foe. I mean, no American president has ever actually said that before. And of course, as I said, he's done so much to offend Asian, particularly his attitude. I mean, just to give you a couple of examples, he turned up more than an hour late for a lunch at the East Asian Summit last year in Manila, and then walked away early, leaving, it wasn't Pompeo then, it was Tillerson, to take his seat. And other summits, he's put his daughter in, to sit down. At the NATO summit, I mean, Norway was there too a few months ago. He came in late for the dinner, picked up the microphone and started haranguing delegates about not paying sufficient, money for the alliance. I mean, it's partly the policies, it's partly the behavior that I think shocks people as well. And of course, for us, it's the policy that counts. I mean, the fact that he walked away from TPP was not so important for the EU per se, but, reneging on climate change was a big deal. And of course, the big one is the Iran deal. I mean, walking away from the Iran deal, which was the crown jewels of European diplomacy, supported by the Obama administration, was a huge shock as well. And as I say, it doesn't really matter which strategy you seem to apply to Trump, it doesn't work too well. No, we missed one? No, here we are. Trade and development. Okay, well, what has happened, and again it's accelerated since Trump came into office, is that the FTAs that we have been negotiating, I mentioned, we've gone down the bilateral route with Vietnam and Singapore, plus Korea already signed, Japan about to go through the ratification process, and several other of the bigger ASEAN countries are also engaged in FTAs with the EU. Plus, we've just opened negotiations with Australia and New Zealand as well. Conditionality remains important. We have a pretty tough and very good trade commissioner, Cecilia Malmström, who always ensures that questions about sustainability, labour rights, the environment are included in the agreement. And so, for example, we can't really move forward with Thailand just now because the generals are still in office there. You probably all know that we are the largest provider of FDI, development aid, technical assistance in the region. And with this, comes, because of the size of the single market, which Norway knows only too well, you have to accept regulatory standards there. So I think that is something that Asian business people and trade associations have come to respect. There's a certain stability. The EU may be a slow-moving animal, but it actually produced some certainty as opposed to uncertainty in terms of trade. Now, today's a big day in Brussels for Asia relations because at 12 o'clock, they will be producing a new connectivity strategy. This has been largely touted as a response to the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative, but it's the EU's approach to dealing with issues like sustainability, transparency, avoidance of debt traps, which, as you know, China has been severely criticized by a number of institutions. I mean, the most glaring example is Montenegro, where Chinese provided, I think, 85 million for a road which is going to eat up about 20% of their GDP, and it's probably not going to work. But I mean, there's dozens of other examples of what they're doing with power stations in Pakistan, and there's been quite a bit of pushback now from Pakistan with the change of government, from Malaysia with the change of government, Sri Lanka, Myanmar. So the real problem was, I think, the Chinese did not properly do the risk assessment before they launched the BRI, but that's a slightly different debate there. As I say, there's political strings attached to most FTAs, like Japan, for example. It wasn't just an FTA that was negotiated. There's a strategic partnership agreement, which basically provides the basis for working with Japan across a whole range of foreign and security policy areas. You know, Japan often had to go to the Diet to get approval for even, you know, sending a frigate for some peacekeeping operation. Well, now we have this framework agreement. They can just do that with a cabinet decision as opposed to going to Parliament every time. A lot of the big global issues we face simply cannot be resolved without Asia. I think that's definitely understood by everyone in the EU now. Migration comes onto the agenda for all these summit meetings, as there's climate change, terrorism, maritime security. The big, I think, breakthrough in this area was Operation Atalanta in the Gulf of Aden, which illustrated quite clearly the EU's approach to comprehensive security, because you've got a military component, you've got a political component dealing with Somalia, you've technical development, training of coast guards, providing development assistance, etc. It's quite a good example of the EU's comprehensive support for security. DPRK, while it's fascinating to see what's going on, I mean, President Moon's meeting Kim Jong-un today in Pyongyang. It's fascinating to see the sort of chemistry of that meeting. And it seems a far distant cry now from Trump and Kim Jong-un threatening to drop nuclear bombs on each other last year ago. So it's a fast-changing area. Where does the EU come in? Well, A, supporting the sanctions, and B, the possibility of being an honest broker if and when it comes to denuclearization. We have the facilities here in Europe to actually play a role in that. What the EU is not doing, and it cannot match the sort of hard power of the US. There's no European aircraft carriers going through the Taiwan Straits. But there are regularly now ships from the Netherlands, from France, from the UK, going through the South China Sea. I mean, we and the Americans are basically on the same page in terms of freedom of navigation. I mean, the Chinese island building program is almost de facto accepted, but the sovereignty issue has not been accepted there. The EU's also developed a niche capability with some countries, also ASEAN, for dealing with smaller insurgencies. They helped the finalization of a peace accord in Aceh in Indonesia. It was an operation led by the former Finnish President Ahtisaari. Still, as an EU delegate, working to resolve the situation in Mindanao and the Philippines as well. We mentioned ASEM because Norway is a member of ASEM. I remember being with the Norwegian delegation in Vientiane 4 years ago when they first joined. I hope people are following that connectivity will be a big issue there. But I think in the corridors, you know, people are going to be talking about how do you deal with Trump, how do we deal with Trump, what lessons can we be learned from it. But I think ASEM is an underrated organization that's quite big. I think we've missed maybe something here. No, I'll go back a bit. Yeah, okay. So these are the, I think, challenges where we have to try and play a bigger role in terms of the EU as such. We've just talked about DPRK, where it's going, what we can do. Again, the big question about China. I think the relationship has changed out of all recognition in the last few years. It's a partnership where there's far greater interdependency. I remember after the financial crisis, there was a feeling in China, you know, America and Europe are finished. But then they soon realized that we actually need a strong American economy, a strong European economy, because of our export and our manufacturing base. And if they are in problems, we're in problems, because it leads to higher unemployment, social problems, etc. So that interdependency, you just think of the Chinese holdings with American treasury bills, is very deep. Myanmar, massive problem. I think everyone here is probably as disappointed as we are in Brussels with the attitude of Aung San Suu Kyi, you know, the great white hope, the great Democrat, you know, human rights champion, etc. And then in government takes a very different line. And of course, this was highlighted by her approach last week in terms of the sentencing on the two Reuters journalists who were quite obviously framed for what they were doing, exposing the atrocities of the army dealing with the Rohingya there. But it's a very difficult situation. The EU is largely supporting the refugee camps in Bangladesh, but in terms of a political solution, I don't think we're anywhere near finding one. Afghanistan, well, it seems to be going on and on and on. You know, it just shows you it's pretty easy to get into a conflict. It's quite far more difficult to get out of it. And when do you get out of it? And what are the consequences of leaving, particularly if it's going to be taken over by the Taliban within 12 months, which is what some assessments would actually say there. But again, talking the day before yesterday with the Indians, they want the EU to stay, they want NATO to stay, but they themselves don't want to get further involved because of their own problems with Pakistan. Then you've got Central Asia, Russia involved in terms of particularly of the drugs. I remember talking to a Chinese expert last year about Afghanistan. Why are you not involved more? You've got big mining concessions there. And the answer was, it's too corrupt. I thought that was quite funny coming from a Chinese businessman. India, Pakistan, I mean, that relationship has been so bad for so many years. One can only hope that when the elections are out of the way next year, let's assume Modi is re-elected, that he and Khan can strike a deal. I mean, Khan, I think, is pretty much close to the army, shall we say. So if these two can strike a deal, it should stick. This is a troubling one. It's just on the fringes of Asia, Iran, Saudi Arabia, because it's quite clear that Trump has put all his support into Saudi Arabia and Israel in terms of all the different issues in the Middle East. And that is going to be a major problem for the EU, because we are trying to maintain the Iran deal, trying to find ways to ensure that the promises we gave to Iran in terms of economic support can be maintained there. This leads to a bigger question about how you provide, at some stage, an alternative payment system to the dollar. I mean, the Americans have had huge advantages by having the dollar as the international currency for years and years. But at some stage, one has to think about how you can actually bring about some alternative there. And this might be the spur to do it. Terrorism is one big area of cooperation between EU and Asia. They've done a lot of good work in countries like Indonesia, for example, on radicalization and how you deal with the problem and how do you sort of de-radicalize people. We can learn quite a lot from them there. And above all, they're really interested now in, you know, the questions of reform of global governance and how we can actually work, if need be, by bypassing the US here. It's the wrong way. So these are the big questions that, you know, I thought we might discuss in the Q&A in terms of how can the EU and Asia shore up the rules-based system? To what extent can you do it when the US is not playing along? I mean, I think I highlighted WTO before. I mean, it really is serious when you don't have sufficient judges to actually operate the dispute settlement mechanism. You're basically heading back into anarchy. The new institutions are obviously in desperate need of reform, and yesterday the Commission came out with a whole series of proposals on WTO reform, which are worth reading. I think they're on the DG Trade website today. But then, you know, we have problems in terms of international representation. There's no single EU seat on the UN or the IMF, for that example. We have a much stronger position in the WTO. In the G20, you've got some member states plus the EU institutions there as well. So it's frankly a bit of a mess. And then on the Asian side, you've got the BRICS still, you know, showing signs of life. You've got the Asia Infrastructure and Investment Bank. Should add the Shanghai Cooperation Initiative, because these are bringing India and Pakistan into what's been a China-Russia institution. So that's quite interesting. And I mentioned BRI, which is the Belt and Road Initiative as well. So I don't think one can, you know, wave a magic wand and reform these institutions. I think it's going to be rather messy. I think if you look at Iran, you know, it's been a coalition of states that have worked together to get the deal and then sought to get the buy-in from the wider international community. I think that's likely to continue. And then I'll bring up the question of leadership. You know, where do we actually have the leaders? I mean, I just look at my own country of origin. I mean, the UK. I have never seen such a poor bunch of political leaders in my lifetime. You know, in the UK, and I think there's some signs of hope in other countries. I mean, a lot of us hope that Macron can really get things moving in France. Merkel's done a good job in Germany, but arguably she's past her peak now, and who's going to come along after that? Because without Franco-German leadership in Europe, the continent, I think, is always going to be in a problem there. And then you've got, again, what's happening in Europe. Nobody should think you can take democracy for granted in Europe. Democracy is a relatively new political system in Europe. You know, for centuries we were authoritarian, and we're fighting each other. You know, it's not so long ago where, some of our member states were either communist or fascist. So nobody should think that we don't have to fight to defend democracy and liberalism from the rise of populism, because always nationalism is the default position of politicians, and one has got to take that into account. So what do I conclude from all this? I think it's quite clear that the actions of the American administration under Trump are pushing the Europeans and Asians closer together, in general, across the board, but more specifically in trade areas, trying to respect some of the international agreements, Paris Accords, the Iran deal that we've had. I don't see the cooperation that was started 5 years ago with the United States developing further under this administration. There may be small areas of cooperation, perhaps still on Myanmar, but not too many others one can think of. Brexit, I think, is going to complicate matters because, A, the Brits have obviously strong ties to many countries in Asia, India for colonial reasons, Japan for historic reasons, and so on. And that will complicate matters because they've said they want to have these new relationships, particularly on the trade front, except given how long it takes to do trade deals, I don't see any possibility of swift trade deals with any Asian country. I mean, Theresa May's first overseas visit was to India, and she didn't offer a single extra visa when she went to Delhi. So I don't think that's going to fly, because trade deals these days have to be comprehensive, including some migration chapter as well. What's been interesting, literally in the last few weeks, I think, are the speeches, articles by Heiko Maas, the German foreign minister, arguing that we need to build a coalition of multilateralists, and mentioning a number of countries involved, the like-minded countries, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, Norway obviously as well here. But, you have to say, is there the political will to do this? If you just look yesterday at what happened in Washington, you had the Polish leaders there given the sort of red carpet, and Trump talking about building Fort Trump in Poland next year. So, I mean, there's the Americans still have a dominant position in NATO, and that's not going to change anytime soon. They still have a dominant position in terms of international finance, technology. And so the solution, if you like, for Europe is very simple. I mean, either you sort of hang together, or you'll be hung by the US, China, and whoever else. And I hope that Norway will play its part in supporting European efforts to have a more coherent system as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Fraser, for a very interesting presentation. I will start with the few of my own reflection before I open the floor, and Bjørnar will also come from our Asian Center, will come up with a few questions. I just wonder, of course, I think you're right in saying that with Trump we see an eagerness by the European states and the EU to move closer to Asia, and perhaps also the other way around. But at the same time, if Europe with this trade war that is going on, if Europe is about to choose between two sides, line up with the US or not. I mean, we also come into another set of other issues, security policy issues, traditions, transatlantic relations, the future of transatlantic relations. I just wonder how deep this can go. So this is my first question, if you can reflect a little bit more on that. So there are some critical kind of decisions for Europe to take. The other question is if we see the kind of the reorientation, if we see if or if we see a fragmentation or integration of Europe's approach to Asia. Because there are, of course, all the different member states also have its own relationship and is eager to develop its own relationship to the different Asian countries, and in particular China. And at the same time, we have, of course, the EU. So and previously, China has also had a certain interest in trying to fragment Europe also. So there are some I wonder if you could say something about that as well. And for many years, the US have been oriented and focusing on Asia. And of course, the most think tank in the US also have had an Asia center for a long time. And I just wonder, when you have your think tank focusing on that, and I wonder how is your impression of the other think tanks in Europe? Do they have the competence and the interest? Is Asia on the radar in the same to the same extent as in the US? So maybe you can start with that, and then you can sign up for questions.
Well, on the transatlantic relationship, I mean, it's going through a very difficult phase, shall we say. And you have to remember that it is still the most important relationship the EU has because of the depth of the economic relationship. I mean, the European companies are investing, I can't remember the exact figures, but at least 20 times more in the US than they are in Asia. So that is, simple fact. You see it when it comes to the Iran deal. All the big European companies, when faced with the possibility of sanctions by the US, Airbus, Total, etc., they said, okay, we stop because our investments in the US are far more important. Where this, I think, can change is the visible shock you saw from Merkel, and that's not a good relationship, Merkel and Trump, when the Americans said that essentially German car exports were a national security threat. I mean, that sent shockwaves through the German political establishment, and just about every German leader has this in its speech at some point. How can our cars be a national security threat? Particularly when Mercedes produces in Alabama and BMW produces in Carolina. So Trump had been to Berlin and hadn't seen enough Chevrolets in the street. So basically, he thought that was a bad deal. So when you've got this sort of simplified attitude, as you have towards NATO as well, how much money are you spending, sort of thing, then it creates not only uncertainty, but eats away at the trust that you have to have in these sort of longer-term relationships. So the question is Trump an aberration? Will things go back to normal if he's out in 2 years or out in 6 years or not? I mean, I think certainly has been a pretty fundamental change in the American political system. It's moved to the right beyond any shadow of doubt. It's much more hard-nosed, for example, on China policy. There's a lot of cross-party support for Trump amongst the Democrats. Business is split, but I think trade unions and others essentially support this tough line on China. And for our position, what did Juncker do when he went to Washington? Juncker played it very cleverly. He basically played to the ego, and Trump was getting a lot of flack from Midwest farmers about soybeans and so on. So they didn't plan to have a press conference, let alone a statement. But the day before, Cecilia Malmström and Selmayr had a meeting with Larry Kudlow and essentially prepared a deal which Kudlow sold to Trump. And Trump was able to go out into the Rose Garden and do a little press conference saying, I've got these Europeans to buy more soybeans. That's good for the farmers. They're going to take more LNG gas, which is good for our energy producers, etc. There was no real commitments there, but it gave him, something to talk about. So he's a guy who is a reality TV star. And one of the most apt, I think, comments was he said to an American media guy. So how many people did you have for your program? You know, you only had 300, you know, cameras. I had 3,000 in Singapore. So that was his measure of success. How many TV cameras came to Singapore to watch this summit there? So nothing to do with the policies, you know, it's just how much media attention do I get? And, you know, you're dealing with someone who doesn't read anything. He doesn't read anything. I mean, he watches Fox News and tweets. I mean, that is policy. And I mean, much as I like playing golf, I mean, this guy plays golf about 3 days a week. I mean, it's just, and he criticized Obama for doing the same thing, so it's quite astonishing. So when you've got someone like that in the White House, I mean, how do you deal with them? And I think at the moment the strategy is simply to hunker down and play for time and hope that things are going to change. That's, I think, what the EU is doing. At the same time, they're trying to start thinking belatedly about how we should be doing more to protect our own interests, particularly on the financial side here. That's why I think these ideas, particularly coming out of Germany at the moment, and supported by Macron as well, are really important. And that's why I hope think tanks will start working on these issues now to see how they can happen. But overall, the transatlantic relationship is not going to disappear. It's going through a difficult stage, but there's so much holding it together in terms of societal contacts that I think it will be okay for the foreseeable future. Divide and rule in China. So, well, I mean, every country tries to divide and rule the EU. I mean, America does. Russia does, and China does. China most famously through its 16+1 operation in Eastern Europe. But I think they've realized that they haven't got very much out of that setup. They've got, you know, 1 or 2 countries have blocked some resolutions on human rights and trade issues of South China Sea, but that's not that much of a gain for them. They've realized, I think, that when it comes to trade and investment issues, give you one example, the Belgrade to Budapest railway that they were financing. They thought they could just go in, give some money, and it would be all right. They didn't realize that, you know, if you're a member state, you're open to questions on public procurement, on sustainability, impact assessments, etc., etc. So it was a bit of a shock to them that they had to go through all this before they could actually move forward. So I think they do realize the EU has a lot of competencies and are focusing more on the EU as such, but they also have the individual relationships with member states and know how to play one off against the other. I think thanks doing enough in Asia? I mean, generally, no. I mean, in Scandinavia, there's not that much been done. I mean, there's a center in Copenhagen, small one here. I don't think there's that much been done in Sweden or Finland. France, the UK, Germany, Italy, and that's about it. I mean, there's occasional experts elsewhere. But I mean, it does require something of an investment in terms of if you're going to learn the language and if you're going to go and spend some time there. But I mean, what's encouraging is there's been an upsurge in both school and university learning of Asian languages, particularly Mandarin in Europe. And that may feed its way into think tanks in the near future. So I'd say we're doing probably about the minimum at the moment, but we need to do much more.
Okay, on that note, I'll give the floor to our research from the Asia Center that we have here at NUPI.
Thank you, Pernilla.
And you also speak Mandarin, I think.
Good.
So we are trying our best to follow your prescription here at NUPI. Thank you again for a marvelous talk and for coming here this morning. Having been given the privilege of opening this question round and give a bit, again, this being a joint Europe Center, China Center setup, which of course dovetails perfectly with what you're doing in Brussels. Giving a bit of some questions from the Chinese side here. I think I have 2 main questions before we go on to the general round. And I think firstly, because I have, over the last couple of weeks now, I have been looking at some Chinese documents from around the era of the early 2000s, 2002, 2003, 2004, 2005, when there was another transatlantic crisis going on, and when the Chinese were immensely optimistic that this is the time and we will have this sort of a EU-China agreement across Eurasia. We get the weapons embargo and the MES status out of the way, and then we'll have EU by our side is building this new multipolar world. And as you know, that sort of fell quite flat when sort of US reasserted itself, Obama came to power, and that transatlantic crisis sort of, you know, was put aside and disappeared for a while. So the question is sort of, as you say, is it different this time around? And it's interesting to note, as you know, here in Norway, with a particularly problematic at times set of relations with China. I think it wasn't very many days after the normalization of ties between China and Norway before the Chinese state television channels started calling around to Norwegian China experts to have them on television to talk about how now, with Trump in the White House, it's time for the EU to look eastwards as a pole of stability in this new world. But the question then is, even when that is a narrative that they want to put onto the rest of the world, there is a lot of tension, I think, right now in China that with regards to the broader political movement of this day, you talk about the crazy town opinion piece that I'm sure we have all read. One of the key points being that of the sort of double track or two-track diplomacy. So Trump may say one thing, but you have an entire political establishment in the US acting along roughly the same lines as, for example, Stoltenberg at NATO will constantly reassert. And it seems that China is really worried that no matter Trump's bluster, what is coming from the US, as you said yourself now, that the normal mainstream in the US has changed somewhat and become more aggressive towards China. And you see, in the case of WTO, you have the trilateral talks here with the US, the EU, and with Japan, with China not involved. So is it really the extent to which Trump has caused the EU to embrace Asia? Is that EU embracing Asia as a whole? Or is it EU embracing Asia's middle powers, say China and Japan, and being in a far more conflicted position vis-a-vis China? Is it right to talk about China as part of Asia overall, or should you sort of distinguish those two in a political analysis? Following on from that one long question, as you mentioned here yourself, there is now increasingly, and in this same context of transatlantic crisis, there is still increasing cooperation and increasingly European hard security assets in the South China Sea. British frigates, French frigates, as you say, the Dutch are there, and the new pride and joy of the British Navy, the HMS Queen Elizabeth, the aircraft carrier, may be down there at one point in not too long. So how do you see this track of increasing military cooperation with the US in the South China Sea conflicting with potential China-European cooperation in the economic sphere? Thank you.
Well, as I said, there's lots of contradictions in all the issues that you raised. I mean, I found it fascinating, like you, that in 2003, China published a policy paper about the EU. This is the first and I think only time China has ever published a paper about another sort of actor in the international system. And it was full of praise for the EU, which was on the cusp of enlargement, which had introduced the euro, which was a stable anchor in the multilateral system, etc. And very quickly it turned sour, because I think they expected that because of the unilateralism of George W. Bush, this would somehow swing Europe into an alliance against the United States. And that clearly did not happen. There were still too many value issues at stake. I mean, we still had an arms embargo on China dating back to 1989 and so on. So that was an unrealistic expectation. And I think we have come to a more sober and more realistic relationship with China now. We know what we cannot deliver, and we know what we possibly can deliver. And I think the relationship is better for this as well. And on the question of China and Asia, no, you can't equate China with Asia as a whole. But, simply, you can't equate Germany with Europe as a whole. I mean, it's a complex continent made up of very long-standing civilizational powers who actually have a very different worldview from what we think they have. I mean, there's very few Brits who know anything about our colonial past in India. I was talking with an Indian minister just a couple of nights ago. I mean, every Indian child knows about Amritsar, where the Brits massacred, a number of Indians. I would say almost nobody in Britain knows about this. Theresa May went to India and didn't even mention Amritsar, So, I mean, it's things like this, Britain's role in the Opium Wars in China. Every Chinese school child knows about this. Arguably, nobody in Britain, apart from a few people, even know about it. So, you have very different perspectives here. And one big criticism I have of most European politicians and policymakers, they don't take this historical context into account when dealing with Asia. The Asians don't forget what Europeans did to them, and it was pretty nasty in many parts of Asia there. So China's certainly not Asia, but China feels, like India, that it has an important civilizational role to play. I think de facto China is a kind of leader of East Asia at the moment. I mean, Japan is in a very difficult position because it has an alliance with the United States, but how long can it rely on that alliance? And interestingly, just in the last few months, there's been a kind of love-in between Tokyo and Beijing in terms of dropping the previous nasty rhetoric about each other and looking for areas to increase cooperation, also with Korea as well. I mean, it's a fascinating triangle to watch, both parts of Korea, plus Japan and China. And then you've got to add in, Taiwan and Hong Kong. So it's fascinating, but, China is certainly not Asia on its own here. On the US angle and Trump, in some of his attitudes, he does get European support. You mentioned the trilateral talks with the US and Japan on steel, but we've only had 2 rounds and they haven't really produced anything. So that's rather minimal. The whole thing's been overshadowed by simply the scale of Trump's tariffs on China and the Chinese response and what the implications are going to be for the global economy. The European interest is to protect European, businesses and jobs. So that's the first priority for the EU, and they have to navigate a way through. I think there's understanding that there's limited ways to influence the White House. Therefore, you have to work on Capitol Hill. So what I think most European leaders are doing now in the EU is focusing more on senators and congressmen, focusing more on governors, because, for example, if you're trying to protect climate change, you go to California and you go to other states to ensure that what they're doing is within the Paris Accords. So you can, in some areas, bypass Washington. You can also build up coalitions amongst the business community when it comes to car tariffs, for example. I mean, they don't want the car tariffs to go up on European because it would complicate the whole supply chains and so on. And that's something that, again, I think the Trump people, I mean, he's been advised by people like Peter Navarro, who basically see manufacturing trade as a zero-sum game and have got a very anti-China approach. And they're in the ascendancy at the moment. And we'll have to see if the balance swings back another way. But at the moment, it's a holding operation, and we're limited in what we can actually do with the Trump administration, particularly as they're about to sanction European companies dealing with Iran, and that's going to poison further transatlantic relations.
Okay, have some more questions. I think we take 2 at a time, if that's okay. So first over here.
My name is Kjell Stamnes. I'm an independent, but I've had some businesses in China. EU and the European states are built on a certain set of values. And important is also to defend a liberal democracy. On the other hand, China has a complete different value set and is far away from a liberal democracy. You didn't touch very much about that challenge. Could you elaborate a little bit more? How should Europe handle that situation without compromising on our own values and defending a liberal democracy? I think that's one of the biggest challenges we are ahead now, is this conflict.
And then Marianne Ridvold is next.
Hey, hi. Thank you for a great talk. Very interesting. I have a couple of questions. My first was actually very similar to the last one, because there seems to be this internal contradiction between kind of normative Europe and its stronger cooperation with China. So if CFSP is pushed forward by Trump, will then the EU have to become more pragmatic if it's going to cooperate more with China to uphold the multilateral liberal order, in a sense, but then at the expense of democracy and human rights? And I was also wondering, you touched upon the EU-US-China relationship in the South China Sea. And I was just wondering how much of an independent policy is the EU developing in the South China Sea conflict vis-a-vis China? Is it simply following the US, or is it developing more of its own independent policy in ASEAN, but also kind of directly with China? There are some disagreements between US and the EU when it comes to the relationship to China, also in this area, as far as I know. And just a very brief last question. Do you see that we're moving from kind of a global multilateral system to a system that is characterized more by bilateral agreements and multilateral agreements, but with few players, as a result of, amongst other things, Trump's behavior? Yes. Okay, thanks.
Okay, on the value system, and as it relates to China, I mean, if you go back to the late 90s, early 2000s, we produced, the Commission produced about 6 communications every couple of years. There was something, and it was basically finger pointing at China in different areas, including values, democracy, human rights, rule of law. And the pushback from China was, we don't interfere with you, so you don't need to interfere with us. And the response of the EU was, well, all our agreements have this conditionality attached to them, and you've got to sign up to them. Chinese basically are happy normally to sign up, as are many other countries, to these agreements and then ignore them. So that is the problem. How you then enforce issues. Some countries refuse to have that. We tried to do a trade deal with Australia some time ago and put in a conditionality clause, and the Australians very bluntly said, "Get lost. We're more democratic than you." So I mean, and it's quite difficult to be a normative power when you're a union of 27, 28 member states. I mean, take the recent example of when Canada got into a spat with Saudi Arabia on human rights. Chrysler Friedland has a very good relationship with Mogherini. Now, Mogherini would have liked to have made a statement supporting Canada, but she has to get the consensus of 27 member states who have got business interests in Saudi Arabia. And, that, again, shows the limitations. I mean, in a nutshell, economics normally trumps human rights. I mean, that's just a fact, And so you've got to be realistic. You've got to look for opportunities. What the EU has done with China is, for example, open a business school in Shanghai where you try and introduce concepts of governance. I mean, I think governance is a key issue in terms of trying to provide a non-corrupt business environment. So how do you introduce the rule of law? And if you can introduce the rule of law, then you're eating away, at the one-party state if you can create an independent judiciary. So there are ways of doing things, but there's no magic bullet. Very rarely do sanctions work about changing the internal behavior. Countries essentially have to do it themselves. Sometimes outside pressure can help. I think in South Africa case it did. But there's not many other examples one can think of here. So I think the best thing we can do is put our own house in order. I mean, if we show to the outside world that we're prepared to sanction Hungary and Poland for their behavior, I think that gives a good message to the outside world. So we should continue to press, but be realistic, but put your own house in order. That would be my sort of answer on that. South China Sea, no, we don't sort of, cooperate per se with the United States. I think we inform riparian states, I mean, i.e. France, Britain, Netherlands, whoever, that they're going through international waters. So it's not a question of coalition against China. It's simply saying this is an international waterway and we exercise our right to actually go through it. And I think that will continue to be the case. I think we were undermined seriously by the attitude of Duterte because, I mean, after the Philippines basically won their case on the South China Sea, Duterte came in and said, well, legality, that's not so important. We want to sell more bananas to China. And so, it rather undercut the whole legal judgment there. On bilateralism, the multilateralism, both will continue. We live in a world where states protect their interests. They will come together, as they do in the European Union, if they think they can get better protection, which is the raison d'etre, if you like, of the EU, negotiating as one bloc against China, the US, or whoever. But sometimes states will try and cut their own deals if they think that that is going to be better for them. So, as I say, there's no black and white division here. It's going to be very murky. It's, I think, a fascinating time to be working in a think tank. There's just so many issues you can look at the moment and also come up with new ideas. This is a time where the world is in flux. And I think, think tanks should be putting forward, more radical ideas about how you can change the system.
We have a few more questions. First here.
Hi, I'm from the U.S. and I follow the policy debates very closely. I always advise people to when you look at this whole situation, Trump aside, and step away from the political theater. You get a much clearer picture of what's actually going on in the U.S. and simply you can dial it right down to a rapid rebalancing of trade that has been long overdue in the U.S. and has a lot of support within the business community in the U.S. And you spoke a lot about cars, and it's simply the U.S. import tariff on European cars is 2.5%. European import tariff on the U.S. is 12.5%. There, in a nutshell, is really what we're talking about, aside from the cars that are manufactured in the U.S. So, as the U.S. rebalances its trade relations, some toes are going to be stepped on, and you're going to have winners and losers in this game. And this is really what the political debate is about, politics aside, from a business standpoint. Do you think the European protectionist policies, which have long been in effect, are going to be a big stumbling block in the rebalancing of these relations with Asia and the U.S.? For example, it's interesting that the steel tariffs that the U.S. imposed on China, 25%, the EU imposed on China over a year and a half ago, same tariffs. So we've got different policies, different protectionist policies, which are in the midst of being rebalanced here. So how are the EU protectionist policies going to play in Europe and in Asia and in this ongoing trade rebalancing in the U.S.?
Take one more.
Hello, my name is Indira and I'm working as an intern here at NUPI. My question is about the global future scenarios that you mentioned in your presentation. So as one extreme, I would like to hear your reflections on the to what extent the concept of the world government is relevant in terms of those increasing cooperation between EU and Asia. And I would like to clarify that by world government, I mean this global world order that would unite states under one global authority. So like the recent challenges, how they influence on this. Thank you.
Well, I mean, having studied international relations for a long time and worked in institutions, I think the concept of world government remains, you know, a concept. I mean, it ain't going to happen. And the differences are just too large. I mean, maybe if we had some threat from, you know, some other galaxy, it might bring us together. But if you look at world history, it's not very encouraging in terms of coming together. I mean, what we have done in Europe in the last 50 years has been quite astonishing when you think about the history of Europe. You know, I mean, this has been just an amazing sort of peace project, but it's still fragile. You know, as I said, nobody should take democracy for granted in Europe or anywhere else. It's a difficult situation. And, you know, we have to learn to cooperate with each other. But the idea of a single world authority, I don't see it. I mean, you know, on protectionism, it is complicated. I mean, you mentioned the cars, but I mean, America has a 25% tariff on EU vans, for example, which the EU is trying to get rid of. When you do a trade negotiation, it's not, you know, we have 2% in your cars and 5% in our cars. You look at a whole range of issues, and the tariffs are generally one of the least important parts. I mean, because firstly, it's a three-dimensional game. You're looking at service sector, which is far more important than manufactured goods nowadays. And you're looking at whose regulations are you going to accept. And that is, I think, the key point in trade negotiations. What regulatory standards are you going to bring about? And this was the problem in the TTIP negotiations. We couldn't agree on a number of areas. But you know, the well-known ones are, you know, chlorinated chickens in America and GMO beef, etc. I mean, even though America won a WTO case, European consumers are not going to eat this stuff. It's as simple as that. So you've got a genuine problem of how you deal with almost different cultures in sectors like medicines and foodstuffs, and how you actually work out a trading regime that affects that allows the standards that each side has set to actually trade. Now, 80–90% of that trade goes on okay. We're talking about a relatively small number of areas where you do have problems, and nobody should, you know, think that because of all the headlines in the media about tariffs, that trade does not flow smoothly. Most trade does flow smoothly at the moment, and we're all better off for it. I mean, the problem is we've not made the argument, politicians, for the benefits of global trade sufficiently, and nor have we, I think, dealt with the consequences. Clinton tried to do it in America, but he didn't tackle, which is, I think, unfortunate for a Democratic president, the consequences of areas, you know, in Michigan, you know, the Rust Belt, to actually provide re-education and training for people who'd lost their jobs. I mean, America had huge winners from globalization, but they also had losers. And I think politicians in the US and in many European countries, including the UK, did not provide sufficient retraining. And hence, you got this reaction, which came via Trump in America first, but also led to Brexit. I mean, if you look at some of the areas that voted Brexit in the UK, there were areas of, you know, high unemployment, unskilled labourers who'd lost their jobs, etc. And somehow they thought that going back 25 years was going to be the solution. Well, I think it's not.
First here and then there.
Thank you very much. My name is Karima Nabi. I am working active at Enlightening Moment. My questions about health. Every day, many children women, men, and many things killed in because the government in Afghanistan not corruption, injustice, and discrimination. Sadly, especially an ethnic Hazara minority. My questions about the international organization, the countries that support the Afghan government, especially European government, European Committee, and everyone in the else. Why? And another questions about how NATO in collection with Ghani and Abdullah, a government, have a true net Afghanistan to hell. And excuse me, and also we ask you revises your policy in Afghanistan. We ask you to not always the discrimination on another minority, especially Hazara. This is my question. I have more questions, but I does not take time. Thank you very much.
Okay.
Hello, thank you for being here at first. My name is Miko Mozabt. I'm from the European delegation to Norway, but I'm here on a personal capacity. I'm wondering about this triangle relationship between the United States, the European Union, and China. Everybody knows that the European Union is in a delicate position now that we see that relations with the US are deteriorating. I guess we would not argue about that. And that probably some might argue that the EU should now embrace China more than before, but it to me feels a bit like being between a hard place and a stone. Do you fear that probably the China might try to play out the European Union against the United States? We have seen that, for example, US car exports to China are now being taxed 25% additionally. And at the same time, the Chinese have lowered their import tariffs for cars coming from other Asian countries such as South Korea and the European Union. So they're indeed giving concessions to us. So the question is, does China probably try to play out the European Union against the US? And the other way around, is there a possibility for the European Union to capitalize on that probably, let's say, Chinese reorientation to Europe as we might push through, I don't know, when it comes, for example, to intellectual property protection or market access or subsidies that the Europeans are not that happy with in China?
Well, I mean, China does try and play Europe off against the United States, which is a perfectly legitimate thing to do. I told you all countries try and play divide and rule if it thinks it's going to suit their own issues. I think things are changing in China. I mean, as China has developed more, their companies are also interested in intellectual property, the legal framework for it, shall we say. So there's a common interest there. The Chinese use tariffs more for political reasons than most other countries do. I mean, if you look at the relationship with Korea, that's a good example of how they've done that over the last few years. But, you know, they also realize that they're dependent on the markets. The two biggest markets are the United States and Europe. And China knows this, and China knows that their future, their own prosperity, depends on, if you like, this co-prosperity sphere. I mean, the three biggest blocks in the world are East Asia, North America, and Western Europe. And that's going to remain, I mean, the case. I mean, Russia's not going to make it. I know you follow Russia closely here, but Russia is a failed state. I mean, Russia's GDP is the same as Spain, you know, that the idea that they're going to be any kind of superpower is nonsense, apart from a few isolated incidents that they can play as a sort of a spoiler. Brazil's not going to make it. I don't think India's going to make it, despite the growth rates at the moment. So basically, we're these three centers of economic power. And they are going to be bound to each other because of the global supply chain. I mean, that's just, I think, a fact of contemporary life. So there will be disputes between them, and we're going through a period of increased disputes, but at the same time, there will be a balance. Sometime it will be regulatory standards. Sometime it will be worked out on tariffs. Sometimes it will just be on a mutual understanding base. And sometimes, you know, they will agree to differ, but they will get along because fundamentally the leadership in all of these countries understand that there is no benefit from any conflict. I mean, the last thing the Chinese want is a military conflict involving the United States. It's far too dangerous for them. So there will be threats, counter threats, but you know, at the same time, there's always negotiations going on there in the background. I mean, the Chinese have delegations in Washington every other week trying to find out what's going on. And there are people in the administration who want to cut a deal with China. It's a question of when Trump thinks the time is going to be ripe. And his whole, I think, political reasoning is, how do I get to the midterms, you know, in 2 months' time? So that's his, you know, prime target, to sort of ensure that he does well there, and then his next target will be 2020 and so on. On Afghanistan, I belong to the minority of people who, frankly, don't believe we should be in Afghanistan. I think it was a mistake to go in there after 9/11. I think that we could have contained the Taliban from outside, if necessary, by a few cruise missile strikes and so on. But the idea of a military invasion of Afghanistan, trying to bring democracy to Afghanistan, is an illusion, and it remains an illusion. People have different views and talk about we should not give up on supporting democracy, women's rights, etc., which are fine. But I'm a realist in international relations and think that, you know, that type of fight for what kind of social, economic, political system you have inside your country has to be done by people inside that country. It cannot be done from people outside. And history, you know, shows that we have, the Brits have twice invaded Afghanistan, the Russians have invaded Afghanistan, and at the moment it's 3-0 for Afghanistan. I think it will be 4-0 quite soon.
Okay, we have 2 more questions. No, 3 more. No, 2. Yeah. First here and then.
Yes. Thanks for. Is it on? Yes. Yes. Thanks for a nice talk. And I'm an academic from the University of Oslo with a long time interest in history and political science. Your reflections on the Trump phenomenon, you know, disruptive, very disruptive. His antics and strange behavior, it's probably not important. And if disruption is seen in the business community as a opportunity to make new strategies to profit from it. So why are the think tanks going into this fetal, the supranational bodies, think tanks are going into fetal position and almost sobbing because of Trump. But Trump is just, like you say, an uneducated person with all these antics, strange things. There's a large administration that pushes through his agenda. And the second thing is, like we heard here, the supranational idea, big government above, you know, all over the world government, we heard from the audience. You were going back into history, Amaritsa. We could throw in the charge of the Light Brigade if you want. I think it's, sorry, I don't mean in a disrespect, it's stupid to go back all these 100 years. UK and Norway and Britain, we have a very good relationship. Should we go back to Lindisfarne Monastery, the cluster where we pillaged and looted? Should you British hate us for that now, like 1,000 years after? Let's forget it. And that brings me to this idea of supranational government. You know, Stalin had that idea, communism. Wasn't very much human rights and democracy in that. Hitler had it. Not very much human rights and democracy in that either. And now the Ayatollahs, you know, the fundamental religious people have that idea of supranational world government. Never been a good idea. And reflecting on that, your bleak outlook for your own country, Britain, bad politicians and the Brexit and so on. Do you have any personal reflections on that being a Brit? Thank you.
Well, I mean, so was there one other?
Yeah, we have one more.
Yeah,
if
okay. Yeah.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much for your presentation. It was very interesting. I just would like to ask you if you can mention a few things more about the connectivity strategy that you said would be adopted today, what it is about, and how it connects to the different countries of the ASEM, given also we have Russia there, and how can it be developed with such a variety of different countries? Thank you.
Okay. You cannot forget history. I mean, history is alive and kicking, particularly in Asia today. I mean, it was turned on and off by the Chinese Communist Party vis-a-vis Japan and other countries in the region. But, you know, if you go to, as I did, you know, a couple of years ago, went to the Yasukuni Shrine in Tokyo. Then I was in Pearl Harbor in Hawaii, and then I was in Nanjing at the Historical Museum. And you're looking at the Second World War. You have three completely different versions of what happened, also in the 1930s there. And that is, of course, used by the ruling parties to shape history and to shape politics. I mean, Abe's father and Xi Jinping's father were involved in these issues. So, I mean, for them, history is real. And it's there on a almost a day-by-day basis. You cannot escape it. You cannot escape the feelings that, you know, Chinese have for what the Brits did, or Indians to what the Brits did a century ago. You can't forget that. And it's senseless to forget it, because, I mean, if you go and act as if it never happened, it's an insult to people. You've got to understand that, you know, we did terrible things. And at some point, you've got to say, you know, I'm not constantly apologizing for it, but you've got to recognize what that is, because it colors the relationship and the attitude of people on the other side of the table. So what I'm arguing for is a better cultural understanding of what people have grown up with in terms of their educational standards and their own history, because we fail to take that into account. I'm not arguing that this should be centerpiece of any sort of negotiation, but as a historian, I'm very strongly in favor of remembering history and understanding the implications of it. Similarly, in terms of you know, the Trump phenomenon and Brexit, I mean, I simply think that referendums are a bad thing. I mean, I would say that as someone who believes in representative democracy. And I'm ashamed that someone with my same name is going to go down in history as the worst prime minister ever. You know, that we had someone... when I talked about our class of politicians, these are politicians who simply have come out of university, worked for a few years in public relations, like David Cameron, and gone into politics. Or been a journalist like Boris Johnson. They have never done a real job. You know, 25 years ago, we had people who've been teachers or university lecturers or trade unionists or business people and lawyers. You know, they had a solid background before they went into politics. Now, politics is, you know, morphed into what the Spectator magazine called the bluffocracy, people who just bluff away few things. You know, we've had 11 justice ministers in 15 years in Britain. We've had 10 Northern Ireland ministers in 12 years. So you can't possibly understand the dossier. You know, the Northern Ireland minister last week admitted that she didn't understand the complexities of the border issue, and she'd been, the minister. You know, I mean, it's just unbelievable the ignorance, you know, you have. So the quality of our politicians have gone down dramatically, and I think, you know, this we have an anti-European virus in Britain. It's a poison in the British political bloodstream, which affects, you know, at the moment about 1/4 of the Conservative Party, 10% of the Labour Party, and so on. And they have managed to basically achieve an internal coup d'etat, rather like the neocons in America in 2002-03, before the Iraq War. A very similar way in which they sort of achieved their goal by the media. I mean, we've had an constant anti-European media outburst for 40 years now in Britain. So the idea that you can simply turn round public opinion fed by this drip of anti-European lies and win a referendum in 3 months is nonsense. I mean Norway would be a good example of that too. You cannot do that. And British politicians, like unfortunately politicians in many other member states, tend to blame Brussels when things go wrong, and they take the credit if things are right. So you never get anyone standing up and saying, look, you know, the benefits of the single market, we've got no roaming charges, you travel around without any passports, you've got a single currency. All completely different from when I was a student, when you had to go to the bank and change money before you went abroad and so on. So, I mean, these benefits are more or less taken for granted, and simply no one has talked about the benefits of what we have created. So, arguably, it might be better for Britain to be out for 10, 15 years to get rid of this anti-European virus and a new generation of politicians come in which can have a more open, realistic relationship with the EU. Connectivity strategy. It won't, I think, capture many headlines coming out today because European leaders are heading for Salzburg to discuss Brexit, migration, security, and so on. But it is important, partly as a response to the Belt and Road Initiative. And essentially what it's doing is setting out the criteria for European financial assistance, investment, which touches on sustainability, touches on transparency, touches on public procurement, level playing field for businesses, etc., and financial rectitude, i.e. the problem with the Belt and Road is that China put so much money into several countries and backed autocratic politicians, which is often what they tend to do. And then when things go wrong, they wonder what happened. Just look what happened in Malaysia, change of government, and now boom. Sri Lanka, boom. Pakistan, boom. It's how the Chinese system works. You go to the top leaders and, you think that's all you need to do. Well, governments can change and you get different priorities coming in. So essentially what the EU paper is doing, saying, look, long term, we agree. We need to provide far more investment into Eurasia. The Asia Development Bank, estimates $30 billion needed to be invested in Asia over the next decade. Well, we can work on this together, but we want to ensure that there are standards here. I think there are some good institutions where the Chinese are playing a proper role. The AIIB, I was talking to someone yesterday who's on the board, and he said the Chinese are really good in terms of the governance of AIIB, no problems there. Less so under the BRICS Development Bank, because they don't have to sort of comply with the shareholders that you do in the AIIB. But I think the Chinese are learning. I think this has been a steep learning curve. Firstly, there was, as I said, a lack of political risk assessment when they started off BRI, and now they're understanding the importance of governance. I was quite recently in Astana and a long chat with some leading figures there, and they said, yeah, the Chinese, they come in, that logistic hubs, but nothing's really improved because the customs are still corrupt. You can build a new highway, a new railway line, but if the trucks or trains are still stopping for 2 days at the border while people are waiting for the bribes, it doesn't really help very much. So governance is going to be the key issue.
Yeah, I think we will end soon. I will just come back to the main question. And your conclusion is that this is actually happening. Europe and Asia is moving closer together. And I think most of us see that there are signs of that. But some of us are a bit skeptical. The jury is still out. And this is happening now. So we have to wait and see. But I just wonder, to end on a more kind of political issue, do you think that China is ready to take on some kind of global role when it comes to the big issues, global issues, like climate change, handling migration, terrorism, and so on, and could cooperate closer with Europe on these issues in a time when the US is kind of not so interested in cooperating with Europe?
I would say they are. China provides more peacekeepers than any other, P5 member. China has been pretty good on climate change because they understand that, environmental issues in China are a big political concern. So they look at the way they've developed electric cars in China. They're a world leader now there. So I think, in some areas where it fits in to their own domestic politics, they are good. I think migration, they're not so good, but they understand what the problems are. On terrorism, they look at it first and foremost through the Uyghur question, so they're not really interested in what's happening elsewhere. So I think it's obviously China-centered, but then, that's what most other countries would do as well. So I think they're getting better at helping out in the global commons, but there's much more that they could still do. But they're learning fast.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for a very interesting presentation. And thank you all for coming and having questions. So a big hand to Fraser Cameron.
Thank you.